Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something absolutely extraordinary, a chapter of Earth's history so dramatic and alien that it makes our wildest fantasy movies look tame by comparison. Picture this, a world where massive walls of ice stretch beyond the horizon, where creatures the size of school buses roam frozen grasslands, and where our own ancestors huddle around fires, carving their survival from bone and stone. This isn't science fiction. This was reality for millions of years during what we call the Ice Age. Before we jump in, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe grab a warm drink, dim the lights a bit, and settle into your favorite spot. Because what we're about to explore together is a journey through deep time, a world so different from ours that it requires a certain kind of imagination to truly grasp. And trust me, once you start to see this frozen planet as it really was, you'll never look at our modern world the same way again. Now, here's the thing most people get wrong about the Ice Age. It wasn't just one long, endless winter. That's the Hollywood version, the oversimplified story we tell kids. The reality was far more complex and, frankly, far more fascinating. The Ice Age was actually a series of cycles, like a massive planetary heartbeat that lasted for millions of years. Periods of intense cold called glacial periods, followed by warmer stretches called interglacials. Each cycle reshaped continents, carved out valleys that still exist today, and created landscapes that would be completely unrecognizable to us now. Think about where you're sitting right now. If you're in Northern Europe, North America, or parts of Asia, there's a decent chance you're in a spot that was once buried under ice hundreds of meters thick. Ice so heavy it actually pressed down on the Earth's crust, making the land sink beneath its weight. And when that ice finally melted, the ground slowly bounced back, a process that's still happening today in some places. But let's start with the big picture. Around 2.5 million years ago, something shifted in our planet's climate system. It wasn't sudden. Nothing in Earth's deep history ever is. Instead, it was a gradual cooling that built momentum over thousands of years. The culprit? A complex dance of factors that scientists are still piecing together today. The main driver was actually astronomical. Our planet doesn't orbit the sun in a perfect circle, and it doesn't spin at a constant angle either. Over tens of thousands of years, these orbital patterns change in predictable ways. Sometimes Earth receives more solar energy during its summers, sometimes less. When the Northern Hemisphere started getting cooler summers, something remarkable happened. Snow that fell during winter began to stick around through the summer months. Year after year, layer upon layer, this snow accumulated and compressed into ice. What started as seasonal snowfall eventually became permanent ice sheets. And once those ice sheets reached a certain size, they began to grow on their own. Here's why. Ice is incredibly reflective. While dark soil or vegetation absorbs sunlight and warms up, ice bounces that energy right back into space. The more ice that formed, the more sunlight got reflected away, which made the planet even colder, which allowed even more ice to form. This feedback loop was so powerful that it eventually covered vast portions of the northern continents in ice sheets that were miles thick in some places. The Laurentide ice sheet stretched across much of North America, from the Arctic Ocean down to what's now the middle of the United States. Imagine standing in modern-day Chicago and looking north toward Canada, but instead of seeing forests and lakes, you'd see a wall of ice rising higher than skyscrapers, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet blanketed Scandinavia and pushed deep into northern Europe. Even Britain was partially covered, connected to mainland Europe by frozen land that's now beneath the North Sea. These weren't just static blocks of ice either. They were dynamic, living systems that grew and shrank, advanced and retreated, grinding across the landscape like impossibly slow bulldozers. The sheer scale of these ice sheets is almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking about masses of ice that contained so much frozen water that global sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. Coastlines that we know today were hundreds of miles inland. Entire continental shelves that are now underwater were dry land, covered in grasslands and forests. This dramatic drop in sea level created land bridges between continents that had been separated by water for millions of years. The most famous of these was Beringia, a vast stretch of tundra that connected Asia and North America, where the Bering Strait exists today. But Beringia wasn't just a narrow strip of land, it was an entire subcontinent, hundreds of miles wide, with its own rivers, valleys, and ecosystems. To the south, Southeast Asia was connected to Australia and New Guinea, forming a massive landmass. The islands of Indonesia were linked by exposed seafloor. Even the Mediterranean Sea was dramatically smaller, with much of its northern coast high and dry. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Despite being called the Ice Age, most of the planet wasn't actually frozen solid. The ice sheets were massive, yes, but they were largely confined to the northern parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. The tropics remained tropical. The equator stayed warm. What changed was the global climate system itself. With so much water locked up in ice, the atmosphere became drier. Vast deserts expanded across regions that today are lush and green. The Sahara Desert grew larger. New deserts appeared in places like Australia and the southwestern United States. At the same time, the temperature difference between the frozen north and the warm equator created incredibly powerful wind systems that constantly redistributed dust and moisture around the planet. These winds were unlike anything we see today. They scoured the landscape, picking up fine particles from the exposed continental shelves and the margins of the ice sheets, then carrying this dust for thousands of miles before depositing it in thick layers. Some of the most fertile agricultural soils on Earth today, including the rich farmlands of the American Midwest and northern China, are made up of this Ice Age dust called loess. The atmosphere itself was different too. Carbon dioxide levels were significantly lower than they are today, which helped keep the planet locked in its frozen state. The air was thinner, drier, and in many regions filled with fine particles that created hazy, pale skies very different from the clear blue we're used to. Now, you might be wondering what all this ice and dust and climate chaos meant for life on Earth. And from being a barren life, that's where our story gets really fascinating. Because Fairless Wasteland, the Ice Age world was teeming with some of the most extraordinary creatures our planet has ever seen. The landscapes that emerged between and around the ice sheets were unlike anything that exists today. Vast grasslands, called the Mammoth Steppe, stretched from Western Europe across Siberia and into North America. These weren't the simple grass prairies we might imagine, but complex ecosystems that supported an incredible diversity of plant and animal life. The grasses themselves were specially adapted to the harsh conditions. They grew low to the ground to avoid the constant wind, developed extensive root systems to anchor themselves in the thin soil, and could photosynthesize efficiently during the brief but intense summer growing seasons. Mixed in with the grasses were hardy herbs, dwarf willows and other shrubs that could survive months of freezing temperatures and near total darkness. But it was the animals that truly defined this world. The Mammoth Steppe supported some of the largest land animals that have ever lived. Woolly mammoths roamed in massive herds, their curved tusks and thick, shaggy coats perfectly adapted to life in the cold. These weren't just larger versions of modern elephants. They were entirely different creatures, built from the ground up for survival in a frozen world. Their trunks were shorter and more muscular than those of their tropical relatives, better suited for digging through snow to reach the grass beneath. Their ears were tiny compared to modern elephants, reducing heat loss in the bitter cold. And their blood had special adaptations that allowed it to carry oxygen efficiently, even when their extremities were nearly frozen. Alongside the mammoths roamed woolly rhinoceroses, massive beasts covered in thick fur, with long horns that they used to sweep snow away from their food. Herds of steppe bison, larger and more robust than any bison alive today, migrated across the grasslands in numbers that would have darkened the horizon. Wild horses, compact and hardy, galloped across the open plains in tight-knit groups. And following all these herbivores were predators that would make our worst nightmares seem tame. Saber-toothed cats, with fangs longer than kitchen knives, stalked the edges of the herds, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, hunted in coordinated packs. Dire wolves, heavier and more powerful than any wolf alive today, followed the migrations in massive packs, their howls echoing across the frozen steppes. This wasn't just a collection of individual animals struggling to survive. It was a complete ecosystem, a web of relationships and dependencies that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. The grass fed the herbivores fed the predators, and their waste fertilized the grass. Even their movements shaped the landscape, keeping the grasslands open and preventing forests from taking over. But perhaps the most remarkable inhabitants of this frozen world were our own ancestors. Early humans didn't just survive in the Ice Age, they thrived, developing technologies and skills that would form the foundation of everything that came after. These weren't primitive cave dwellers cowering in fear from the cold and the predators. They were sophisticated hunters and gatherers who understood their environment in ways that would impress modern survivalists. They tracked the migrations of the great herds across hundreds of miles. They knew which plants were safe to eat and which ones could kill. They could read weather patterns in the clouds and predict where to find fresh water even in the depths of winter. Their tools were works of art as much as instruments of survival, stone blades knapped with such skill that they were sharper than modern surgical scalpels, bone needles fine enough to sew waterproof clothing from animal hides, spear throwers that could hurl projectiles with deadly accuracy across distances that would challenge a modern archer. And somehow, in the midst of all this struggle for survival, they found time to create. Deep in caves across Europe and Asia, they left behind some of the earliest art known to humanity. Not crude scratches or simple handprints, but sophisticated paintings and carvings that show a deep understanding of the animals they shared the world with. These cave paintings weren't just decorations. They were possibly the first human attempts to understand and document the world around them. Every line, every curve, every carefully chosen pigment was a way of capturing something essential about the mammoth steppe and the creatures that ruled it. What's truly amazing is that this entire world, this complete ecosystem that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, was already beginning to change. The astronomical cycles that had triggered the Ice Age were shifting once again. Summers were gradually getting warmer. The massive ice sheets, which had seemed permanent and unchanging, were starting their slow retreat. But that's a story for our next episode, where we'll explore how this frozen world began to crack and melt, and what happened to all those incredible creatures when their icy domain started to disappear. The retreat wasn't sudden or dramatic, like you might see in a disaster movie. Instead, it unfolded over thousands of years, a gradual loosening of winter's grip that our ancestors would have experienced as subtle shifts in the rhythms they'd known for generations. Summers lasted a few days longer. The snow melted back just a little further each year. Rivers that had been frozen solid for months began to flow freely for longer stretches. But even these small changes set off a cascade of consequences that would reshape the entire planet. As the ice sheets began to shrink, they released torrents of meltwater that carved new channels across the landscape. Rivers that had been mere trickles became raging torrents. Valleys that had been dry for millennia suddenly filled with rushing water that carved deeper and deeper into the bedrock with each passing season. These weren't gentle streams meandering through meadows. We're talking about floods that would dwarf anything in recorded human history. Imagine walls of water hundreds of feet high, carrying boulders the size of houses, gouging out canyons in a matter of days that would take millions of years to form under normal circumstances. The Columbia River Gorge in the Pacific Northwest, the channeled scablands of Washington state, these dramatic landscapes were carved not by millions of years of gradual erosion, but by catastrophic floods that reshaped the continent in mere decades. Some of these floods were triggered by the collapse of massive ice dams that had held back enormous glacial lakes. Picture a body of water larger than all the Great Lakes combined, held in place by a wall of ice hundreds of feet high. When that dam finally gave way, the entire lake would empty in a matter of weeks, sending an unimaginable volume of water racing toward the sea. The sound alone would have been beyond description, a rumbling that could be felt in the ground hundreds of miles away, growing louder and louder until it became a roar that drowned out every other sound on Earth. Trees, boulders, entire hillsides would be swept away like twigs in a stream. The very shape of continents was being rewritten by these floods. As the ice retreated and the meltwater found its way back to the oceans, sea levels began to rise. This happened slowly at first, then accelerated as more and more ice melted. The land bridges that had connected continents for thousands of years began to disappear beneath the waves. Beringia, that vast grassland between Asia and North America, gradually shrank until it was just a narrow strip of land, then finally vanished entirely beneath the Bering Strait. For the animals and humans living on these disappearing lands, it must have been like watching their world literally sink into the sea. Coastlines that had been stable for generations suddenly became tidal zones. Hunting grounds that had supported communities for centuries were swallowed by rising waters. Entire populations were forced to migrate to higher ground, competing for resources in regions that were already occupied. The rising seas weren't just claiming low-lying areas near the coasts either. As the ocean levels rose, they pushed inland along river valleys, creating vast estuaries and wetlands where there had once been dry land. The geography that humans had known and mapped in their collective memory was becoming obsolete almost overnight. Meanwhile, the climate itself was undergoing its own transformation. As the ice sheets shrank, they lost their ability to reflect solar energy back into space. Dark soil and vegetation began to absorb more heat, accelerating the warming process. The massive temperature differences between the ice-covered north and the warmer south, which had driven the powerful wind systems of the Ice Age, began to moderate. This had profound effects on weather patterns around the world. The dust storms that had been a constant feature of Ice Age life began to subside as the winds calmed and vegetation took hold on previously barren ground. The dry, hazy skies gave way to clearer air and more regular precipitation patterns. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, much of the northern hemisphere began to receive enough rainfall to support forests, and forests did return, spreading northward like a green tide following the retreating ice. First came the hardy pioneers, birch and pine trees, that could tolerate poor soils and harsh conditions. These early forests were nothing like the dense woodlands we might imagine today. They were sparse, scrubby affairs, with plenty of open space between the trees. But even these modest forests represented a dramatic change for creatures that had evolved in the open grasslands of the mammoth steppe. The vast herds of grazing animals found their migration routes blocked by growing stands of trees. The clear sight lines that had allowed predators to spot prey from miles away became cluttered with vegetation. The entire structure of the ecosystem was shifting beneath their feet. Some animals adapted to these changes better than others. Deer, which had been relatively minor players during the height of the Ice Age, thrived in the new forested environment. Wild boar found plenty to eat among the roots and nuts of the expanding woodlands. Smaller predators like lynx and wolverines were well suited to hunting in dense cover. But for the giants of the Ice Age, the spreading forests were a death sentence. Woolly mammoths, built for life on open grasslands, couldn't navigate the increasingly dense vegetation. Their massive bodies, which had been perfect for conserving heat on the frozen steppes, became liabilities in the warmer, more humid forest environment. Their specialized diet of steppe grasses was being replaced by plants they couldn't digest. The woolly rhinoceroses faced similar challenges. These massive browsers had evolved to feed on the low-growing shrubs and herbs of the tundra. As forests expanded and these food sources disappeared, they found themselves in a world that no longer had a place for them. Even the predators that had ruled the Ice Age world were struggling. Saber-toothed cats, with their specialized hunting techniques designed for open country, couldn't adapt to stalking prey through dense undergrowth. Cave lions, which had relied on coordinated pack hunting across vast open spaces, found their tactics useless in the confined spaces of the forest. The dire wolves faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all. These massive pack hunters had evolved to follow the great herds across continental distances. As those herds dwindled and fragmented, there simply wasn't enough large prey to support their numbers. The survivors had to compete with smaller, more adaptable wolves that were better suited to hunting the deer and smaller game of the forest. But it wasn't just the changing vegetation that was driving these extinctions. There was another factor at play, one that would prove to be even more decisive in determining which species survived and which disappeared forever. Humans were changing too, and their relationship with the megafauna of the Ice Age was becoming increasingly complex and deadly. During the height of the glacial period, humans had been just another species struggling to survive in a harsh environment. They were skilled hunters, certainly, but they were also relatively few in number and armed with fairly primitive weapons. Taking down a woolly mammoth or a giant ground sloth was a rare and dangerous undertaking that required careful planning, perfect timing, and more than a little luck. But as the climate warmed and became more hospitable, human populations began to grow and spread into new territories. More importantly, their hunting techniques became increasingly sophisticated. The atlatl, or spear thrower, gave them the ability to hurl projectiles with much greater force and accuracy than ever before. Coordinated group hunting strategies allowed small bands of humans to take down prey many times their size with unprecedented efficiency. Archaeological evidence from kill sites across North America and Europe tells a story of increasingly systematic hunting of large animals. These weren't occasional opportunistic kills, but organized operations that targeted the largest and most vulnerable members of herds. Young mammoths, pregnant females, elderly individuals, all became preferred targets for human hunters who had learned to exploit every weakness in their prey's behavior. The impact was devastating. Species that had survived multiple Ice Age cycles, that had weathered climate changes far more severe than anything they'd faced before, began to disappear with alarming speed. The American mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the short-faced bear, all vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival in their territories. In Europe and Asia, where humans had coexisted with megafauna for much longer, the extinctions were more gradual, but no less complete. The woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and cave bear all disappeared from most of their former range, surviving only in isolated refuges where human impact was minimal. Some scientists argue that climate change alone was responsible for these extinctions, that the warming world and changing vegetation would have doomed the Ice Age giants regardless of human intervention. Others point to the timing of the extinctions, which closely follows the spread of human populations, as evidence that hunting pressure was the primary cause. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The changing climate certainly made these animals more vulnerable by fragmenting their habitats and reducing their food sources. But human hunting, even with relatively primitive technology, was likely the final straw that pushed many species over the edge into extinction. What's particularly tragic about these extinctions is how quickly they happened. Ecosystems that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years collapsed within a few millennia. The great herds that had thundered across the mammoth steppe were reduced to scattered individuals clinging to existence in increasingly isolated pockets of suitable habitat. The woolly mammoth provides perhaps the most poignant example of this collapse. These magnificent creatures, which had been among the most successful large mammals on Earth, were reduced to a few small populations on remote Arctic islands. The last known woolly mammoths died out on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean just 4,000 years ago, long after the pyramids were built and civilization had begun to flourish in other parts of the world. By that time, the world had been transformed beyond recognition. The vast ice sheets had retreated to their current positions in Greenland and Antarctica. Sea levels had risen to approximately their current height. The mammoth steppe had given way to the forests, grasslands, and tundra we know today. The age of giants was over, and a new chapter in Earth's history was about to begin. But before we move forward to explore what came next, it's worth pausing to consider what was lost when the Ice Age ended. This wasn't just the extinction of a few large animals. It was the collapse of entire ecosystems, the end of evolutionary lineages that stretched back millions of years, and the loss of a kind of wildness that we can barely imagine today. The world that emerged from the melting ice was in many ways more familiar to us, more recognizable as the Earth we know. But it was also a diminished world, one where the giants had fallen, and the vast open spaces had been carved up and enclosed. It was the world where human civilization would finally take root and flourish. But it was also a world where the age of megafauna had come to an end. The transformation wasn't just about what disappeared, it was also about what took its place. As the great ice sheets pulled back toward the poles, they left behind a landscape that was raw, scraped clean, and ready for colonization by entirely new forms of life. The retreat of the glaciers created what scientists call ecological opportunity on a massive scale. Think about it this way. For hundreds of thousands of years, vast areas of the northern continents had been locked under ice. No plants could grow there, no animals could live there. It was essentially dead space from a biological perspective. But as the ice melted, it revealed millions of square miles of virgin territory, landscapes that hadn't seen sunlight or supported life for geological ages. The first colonizers of these newly exposed lands were the most basic forms of life. Lichens and mosses crept in almost immediately, able to survive on bare rock with virtually no soil. These pioneer species began the slow process of breaking down the stone, creating the first thin layers of soil that would eventually support more complex plant communities. Behind the lichens came grasses and herbs, their seeds carried by wind and migrating animals. These weren't the same species that had dominated the mammoth steppe. Many of those had gone extinct along with the animals that had depended on them. Instead, new plant communities evolved, adapted to the changing climate and the different growing conditions of the post-glacial world. What's fascinating is how quickly this transformation happened. Archaeological evidence suggests that some areas went from barren ice-scoured rock to dense forest in just a few centuries. That might seem like a long time from a human perspective, but in geological terms, it's almost instantaneous. Entire ecosystems were assembling themselves in fast forward, species finding new ecological niches and establishing relationships that had never existed before. The animals that survived the Great Extinction weren't just hanging on in reduced numbers. Many of them were actively expanding into new territories and evolving new behaviors. Brown bears, for example, spread rapidly across the newly forested landscapes of North America and Europe. Some populations began specializing in fishing for salmon in the rivers swollen with glacial meltwater. Others became expert at digging for roots and tubers in the rich soils left behind by the retreating ice. Wolves underwent their own transformation during this period. With the great herds of mammoth steppe gone, they had to adapt to hunting smaller, more elusive prey in forested environments. Some populations became smaller and more agile, better suited to chasing deer through dense undergrowth. Others developed new social structures with smaller pack sizes that could more efficiently hunt the scattered prey of the post-glacial world. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation was happening to the humans themselves. For hundreds of thousands of years, human societies had been shaped by the harsh demands of Ice Age survival. Life had been nomadic, following the herds across vast distances, always moving in search of food and shelter. Social groups had been small, probably no more than a few dozen individuals, bound together by the absolute necessity of cooperation in an unforgiving environment. As the climate warmed and stabilized, new possibilities began to emerge. The forests that replaced the mammoth steppe were rich in resources that didn't require constant movement to exploit. Nut trees provided reliable sources of food that could be harvested seasonally from the same locations year after year. Rivers teeming with fish offered protein that didn't need to be hunted across hundreds of miles of territory. For the first time in human history, it became possible to stay in one place for extended periods. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increasingly permanent settlements. These weren't cities by any stretch of the imagination, but they were a fundamental departure from the purely nomadic lifestyle that had defined human existence since the species first evolved. The implications of this shift were enormous. When you don't have to carry everything you own on your back, you can start accumulating possessions. You can invest time and energy in creating tools and art objects that are too heavy or fragile for a nomadic lifestyle. You can begin to modify your environment rather than simply adapting to it. Evidence of this new way of life appears in archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. Stone tools become more specialized and sophisticated. Pottery appears for the first time, allowing people to store food and water more efficiently. Permanent hearths suggest that fires were maintained in the same locations for months or even years at a time. Perhaps most significantly, there's evidence that people began deliberately managing their environments. They started clearing small patches of forest to encourage the growth of useful plants. They began setting controlled fires to maintain grasslands that attracted game animals. These weren't farming in the sense we understand it today, but they were the first tentative steps toward agriculture. The transition wasn't uniform across the globe. In some regions, the old nomadic lifestyle persisted for thousands of years after the ice retreated. In others, the shift towards settled life happened remarkably quickly. But everywhere humans lived, the end of the Ice Age marked the beginning of a fundamentally different relationship with the natural world. This period, which archaeologists call the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, was a time of extraordinary innovation and adaptation. Humans were essentially reinventing themselves, developing new technologies and social structures to take advantage of the opportunities presented by a warming world. The bow and arrow, which would become one of the most important tools in human history, was perfected during this period. Unlike the heavy spears that had been used to hunt mammoth and bison, bows were perfect for hunting the smaller, more agile animals of the post-glacial forests. They were also much more versatile, allowing hunters to take prey at greater distances and with much less risk. Fishing technology also underwent rapid development. Archaeological sites from this period are full of fish hooks, harpoons, and net weights. People learned to build fish weirs and traps, structures that could capture large numbers of fish with minimal human intervention. For the first time, it became possible to harvest protein from aquatic environments on an industrial scale. But it wasn't just technology that was changing. Human social structures were evolving as well. The small egalitarian bands that had characterized Ice Age society began to give way to larger, more complex groups. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Mesolithic communities included hundreds of individuals living in semi-permanent settlements. With larger group sizes came new forms of social organization. There's evidence of specialized roles within communities, with some individuals focusing on tool making, others on hunting, still others on gathering plant foods. This specialization allowed for much more efficient exploitation of resources and the development of increasingly sophisticated technologies. Trade networks also began to emerge during this period. Archaeologists have found stone tools made from raw materials that originated hundreds of miles from where they were discovered. Shells from coastal areas appear in inland sites. Amber from the Baltic appears in settlements across Europe. These weren't casual exchanges between neighboring groups, but organized trade relationships that spanned vast distances. The artistic traditions that had flourished in the Ice Age caves continued to evolve in the post-glacial world. Rock art appears across Europe, Africa, and Australia, depicting the animals and landscapes of the warming world. But there's something different about this art compared to the cave paintings of the Ice Age. It's more varied, more experimental, suggesting that artists were no longer constrained by the rigid demands of survival. Some of the most intriguing art from this period consists of abstract symbols and patterns that seem to have no obvious connection to the natural world. These may represent some of the earliest attempts at symbolic communication, the precursors to written language. If so, they mark another fundamental transition in human development, the beginning of the ability to record and transmit complex information across generations. Music also seems to have undergone significant development during this period. Bone flutes and other musical instruments become much more common in archaeological sites. Some of these instruments are surprisingly sophisticated, capable of producing complex melodies and harmonies. Music, like art, suggests that humans were beginning to have the time and energy for activities that went beyond simple survival. The spiritual life of Mesolithic peoples is harder to reconstruct from archaeological evidence, but there are tantalizing hints that religious and ceremonial practices were becoming more elaborate. Burial sites from this period show evidence of complex rituals, with bodies accompanied by grave goods and arranged in specific positions that suggest belief in an afterlife. Some sites contain evidence of large-scale ceremonial gatherings, places where multiple groups would come together for festivals or religious observances. These gatherings would have served important social functions, allowing for the exchange of goods, information, and marriage partners between otherwise isolated communities. But perhaps the most significant development of the post-glacial period was one that wouldn't fully manifest for several more millennia. Scattered across the Middle East, people were beginning to experiment with deliberately planting and tending wild grasses. These early agricultural experiments were modest affairs, small patches of cultivated land that supplemented hunting and gathering rather than replacing them entirely. The plants they were working with weren't much different from their wild ancestors. The wheat and barley of these early farmers produced smaller seeds and were much more difficult to harvest than modern varieties. But they represented something revolutionary, the first attempts to control and direct the forces of nature rather than simply adapting to them. These agricultural experiments were happening in multiple locations independently, suggesting that the transition from hunting and gathering to farming was almost inevitable once the climate stabilized enough to make it possible. In the Middle East, people were domesticating wheat and barley. In China, they were cultivating rice and millet. In the Americas, they were developing corn, beans, and squash. Each of these agricultural systems would eventually give rise to complex civilizations, but that transformation was still thousands of years in the future. For now, these early farmers were simply trying to make their lives a little more predictable and secure in a world that was still adjusting to the absence of ice. The post-glacial world was a place of tremendous opportunity and experimentation. The retreat of the ice had created new environments and new possibilities that humans were only beginning to explore. The foundations were being laid for developments that would eventually lead to cities, writing systems, and complex societies, but the immediate focus was on adaptation and survival in a world that was still very much in flux. As we look back at this period from our modern perspective, It's tempting to see it as a time of inevitable progress towards civilization. But for the people living through it, it was simply a matter of making the best of the opportunities presented by a changing world. They were pioneers in the truest sense, exploring and settling territories that had never been inhabited by humans before. The story of how these post-glacial societies eventually gave rise to agriculture and civilization is fascinating in its own right, but it's also a continuation of the same themes that defined life during the Ice Age itself. Adaptation, innovation, and the constant struggle to find new ways of surviving and thriving in an ever-changing world. In many ways, we're still living in the aftermath of the Ice Age. The landscapes we inhabit, the climate we depend on, even the genetic makeup of the plants and animals we've domesticated, all bear the fingerprints of that great transformation that began with the retreat of the glaciers. Understanding that history helps us appreciate not just where we came from, but also the remarkable resilience and adaptability that allowed our species to survive and flourish through one of the most dramatic periods of environmental change in Earth's history. The transformation wasn't just happening on land either. The oceans themselves were undergoing their own dramatic metamorphosis as billions of gallons of meltwater poured in from the dissolving ice sheets. This wasn't just a simple matter of water levels rising. The entire chemistry and circulation patterns of the world's oceans were being rewritten in real time. Picture the North Atlantic during this period. For thousands of years, it had been a relatively stable body of water with predictable currents and temperatures. But now it was being bombarded with massive influxes of fresh water from the melting Laurentide ice sheet. This fresh water was lighter than the salty ocean water, so it spread across the surface like a vast lens, disrupting the normal patterns of circulation that had existed for millennia. These disruptions had consequences that rippled across the entire planet. The ocean currents that carry warm water from the tropics toward the poles were being interrupted and redirected. Weather patterns that had been relatively stable for thousands of years suddenly became chaotic and unpredictable. In some regions, this led to rapid warming as tropical heat was distributed to new areas. In others, it caused sudden cooling as the normal flow of warm water was cut off. The marine ecosystems were equally affected. Fish populations that had thrived in the cold, nutrient-rich waters of the Ice Age found themselves struggling to adapt to warmer, less productive seas. Some species went extinct entirely. Others underwent rapid evolutionary changes, developing new feeding strategies and migration patterns to cope with the altered ocean environment. For coastal human populations, these changes in marine ecosystems were both challenging and opportunistic. Traditional fishing grounds might become barren overnight as fish populations moved to new areas or disappeared entirely. But new opportunities also emerged as previously uninhabitable coastal areas became accessible and productive. The rising seas also created entirely new types of environments. Vast estuaries formed where rivers met the encroaching ocean, creating brackish water ecosystems that were incredibly rich in nutrients and marine life. These estuarine environments became some of the most productive areas on the planet, supporting dense concentrations of fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. Many human communities began to specialize in exploiting these rich coastal environments. Archaeological evidence from sites around the world shows that people were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their use of marine resources. Shell middens, massive piles of discarded oyster and clam shells, appear at coastal sites across every continent, testament to the importance of shellfish in post-glacial diets. But it wasn't just shellfish that people were harvesting from these new coastal environments. The estuaries and wetlands created by rising sea levels became crucial stopping points for migrating waterfowl. Enormous flocks of ducks, geese, and other birds would concentrate in these areas during their seasonal migrations, providing opportunities for mass harvesting that could sustain communities through lean winter months. The technology for exploiting these resources became increasingly sophisticated. People developed specialized nets and traps for catching fish in shallow waters. They learned to build fish weirs, essentially underwater fences that could channel entire schools of fish into confined areas where they could be easily caught. Some communities even developed primitive forms of aquaculture, creating artificial ponds where they could raise fish and shellfish. Meanwhile, inland communities were dealing with their own set of challenges and opportunities. The retreat of the glaciers had left behind a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and completely transformed. River valleys that had been carved by glacial meltwater now contained streams that were a fraction of their former size. Lakes that had formed behind ice dams were either draining away entirely or stabilizing at much lower levels. For people who had lived in these areas for generations, these changes required constant adaptation. Hunting strategies that had worked for centuries might suddenly become obsolete as animal migration routes shifted to follow new water sources. Seasonal camps that had been positioned near reliable lakes or streams might find themselves high and dry as water levels dropped. But these same changes also opened up new possibilities. Areas that had been too marshy or flood-prone to inhabit during the peak melt period gradually dried out and became suitable for more permanent settlement. Rich alluvial soils deposited by ancient floods provided excellent growing conditions for wild plants and eventually for the first experimental crops. The forests that were spreading across these post-glacial landscapes weren't uniform. Different regions developed distinct forest communities depending on their climate, soil conditions, and the particular mix of species that happened to colonize them first. In some areas, dense coniferous forests dominated, creating shaded environments that were rich in game but poor in edible plants. Other regions developed mixed deciduous forests with a much greater diversity of food resources. Oak forests provided acorns that could be processed into nutritious flour. Nut trees like hazelnuts and walnuts offered concentrated sources of fat and protein. Berry-producing shrubs created seasonal bonanzas of easily gathered food. Human communities began to develop increasingly sophisticated knowledge of these forest ecosystems. They learned which trees produced the most nuts in different years, how to predict when various plants would fruit, and how to manage forest fires to maintain the open conditions that favored certain useful species. This deep ecological knowledge allowed post-glacial peoples to extract an enormous variety of resources from forest environments. Archaeological sites from this period contain evidence of dozens of different plant species being used for food, medicine, tool-making, and other purposes. People weren't just adapting to these new ecosystems. They were learning to actively manage them. Controlled burning became a crucial tool in this management strategy. By setting small, carefully managed fires, people could maintain clearings in the forest that attracted game animals and encouraged the growth of useful plants. These weren't random or destructive fires, but sophisticated applications of ecological knowledge that had been built up over generations of careful observation. Some communities went even further, beginning to actively plant useful species in favorable locations. They would transplant nut trees closer to their settlements, scatter seeds of useful plants in cleared areas, and even dig small irrigation channels to water particularly valuable groves. These practices weren't agriculture in the formal sense, but they represented a significant step toward the active manipulation of natural systems. The social implications of these new resource management strategies were profound. Unlike the nomadic hunting lifestyle of the Ice Age, these forest management techniques required long-term thinking and collective action. You couldn't just burn a section of forest and expect immediate results. It might take years or even decades for the desired plant communities to establish themselves. This need for long-term planning encouraged the development of more stable social institutions. Knowledge about forest management had to be preserved and transmitted across generations. Territories had to be managed collectively to ensure that short-term exploitation didn't undermine long-term productivity. Conflicts over resource access had to be resolved through negotiation rather than simply moving to a new area. Archaeological evidence suggests that some post-glacial communities developed quite sophisticated systems of resource management and territorial control. Certain areas were apparently reserved for specific purposes. Nut groves that were carefully tended and harvested at specific times. Fishing areas that were used according to complex schedules. Hunting territories that were managed to maintain game populations. These management systems required not just ecological knowledge, but also social institutions capable of enforcing rules and resolving disputes. There's evidence of increasingly elaborate ceremonial sites during this period, places where multiple communities would gather for festivals, trade, and probably also for the negotiation of territorial agreements. The artwork from these ceremonial sites is particularly intriguing. Unlike the naturalistic animal paintings of Ice Age caves, much of the post-glacial rock art is more abstract and symbolic. Geometric patterns, human figures engaged in ceremonial activities, and complex arrangements of symbols that might represent territorial boundaries or resource calendars. Some researchers have suggested that these abstract symbols represent early forms of record-keeping, ways of encoding complex information about territorial rights, seasonal schedules, and resource management practices. If so, they would represent another crucial step in the development of human civilization, the beginning of external information storage systems that could preserve knowledge beyond the limits of human memory. The tool technologies of this period also reflect the increasing sophistication of post-glacial societies. Stone tools become more standardized and specialized, suggesting that tool-making was becoming a specialized craft practiced by skilled artisans rather than a general skill that everyone possessed. Different regions developed distinctive tool traditions, indicating that communities were becoming more culturally distinct as they adapted to specific local environments. But perhaps the most significant technological development of this period was the increasing use of composite tools. Implements made from multiple materials combined in sophisticated ways. Hafted axes that combined stone blades with wooden handles, arrows with stone points, wooden shafts and feather fletching, fishing spears with multiple prongs made from different materials. These composite tools were much more effective than their simple predecessors, but they also required much more specialized knowledge to create and maintain. You needed to understand the properties of different materials, know how to process and shape them, and master the techniques for joining them together in durable ways. The social implications of this technological sophistication were enormous. Communities that possessed superior tool-making knowledge had significant advantages in exploiting their environments. This created incentives for the development of trade networks through which technological innovations could spread, but it also created new forms of social inequality based on access to specialized knowledge and materials. Evidence of long-distance trade becomes much more common during the post-glacial period. High-quality stone materials appear hundreds of miles from their sources. Shells from specific coastal areas are found in inland sites across entire continents. Amber, which was particularly prized for its beauty and supposed magical properties, was traded across distances of thousands of miles. These trade networks weren't just about exchanging materials. They were also conduits for the spread of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. An innovative hunting technique developed in one region could spread across an entire continent through these trading connections. New artistic styles, ceremonial practices, and even languages could diffuse along the same routes. The increasing complexity of these trade networks required new forms of social organization. Someone had to organize trading expeditions, negotiate exchanges with distant communities, and ensure that valuable goods could be transported safely across hostile or unfamiliar territories. These roles probably gave rise to some of the first social specialists who weren't directly involved in food production. Archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals in post-glacial communities had access to much larger quantities of trade goods than others. Certain burials contain elaborate assemblages of exotic materials and finely crafted objects that would have represented enormous wealth by the standards of the time. This suggests that post-glacial societies were becoming more socially stratified, with some individuals accumulating power and resources that set them apart from the rest of their communities. These emerging elites probably played crucial roles in organizing the increasingly complex economic and social systems of post-glacial societies. They would have been the ones who maintained trading relationships with distant communities, organized large-scale resource management projects, and mediated disputes between different groups. But their power would have been quite different from the authority wielded by later agricultural elites. In societies that were still primarily based on hunting and gathering, no individual or group could control access to the basic necessities of life. Food, water, and shelter were still available to anyone with the knowledge and skills to obtain them from the natural environment. Instead, post-glacial elites probably derived their power from their ability to organize collective activities and maintain social relationships. They were the ones who knew how to negotiate trading agreements, plan seasonal movements, and coordinate the complex scheduling required for effective resource management. Their authority was based on social skills and specialized knowledge rather than control over material resources. This form of leadership was probably quite fluid and situational. Different individuals might take leading roles depending on the specific challenges facing their communities. A skilled hunter might lead during times when game was scarce. A gifted diplomat might take charge when negotiations with neighboring groups were required. A knowledgeable elder might provide guidance during seasonal ceremonies or resource management decisions. The flexibility of these leadership systems was probably crucial for the success of post-glacial societies. The environments they inhabited were still highly variable and unpredictable. Climate fluctuations, resource failures, and conflicts with neighboring groups could create sudden crises that required rapid adaptation. Rigid hierarchical systems might not have been able to respond effectively to these challenges. Instead, post-glacial societies developed what anthropologists call heterarchical systems, forms of organization where authority could shift between different individuals or groups depending on circumstances. These systems combined the benefits of specialized knowledge and coordinated action with the flexibility needed to adapt to changing conditions. The archaeological record of this period shows increasing evidence of these complex social systems in action. Sites become larger and more elaborate, suggesting that communities were growing in size and organizational complexity. Ceremonial centers appear that could accommodate gatherings of hundreds or even thousands of people. Storage facilities suggest that communities were managing resources on increasingly large scales. But at the same time, there's no evidence of the kind of centralized control that would characterize later agricultural societies. No palaces, no monumental architecture, no clear indicators of permanent ruling classes. Instead, what we see is a kind of managed complexity, societies that were becoming more sophisticated and organized, while maintaining the flexibility and egalitarian values that had served them well during the Ice Age. This balance between complexity and flexibility would prove to be crucial as post-glacial societies faced their next major challenge. Climate change hadn't ended with the retreat of the glaciers. The warming trend that had begun at the end of the Ice Age was continuing, and in some regions, it was accelerating. New environmental pressures were building that would once again force human societies to adapt or face extinction. But that's a story that leads us toward an even more dramatic transformation in human history: the development of agriculture and the rise of the first civilizations. The post-glacial period we've been exploring was in many ways a bridge between the mobile, egalitarian societies of the Ice Age and the complex hierarchical civilizations that would follow. Understanding this transitional period helps us appreciate just how remarkable the human capacity for adaptation really is, and how the foundations of our modern world were laid by communities that were still living in the shadow of the great ice sheets. The real turning point came not with a bang, but with a handful of seeds scattered in the fertile soil of a warming world. Picture this. Somewhere around 11,000 years ago, in the hills of what we now call the Middle East, a woman kneels beside a patch of wild grass. She's done this countless times before, gathering the small, hard seeds that her people have eaten for generations. But today, something different happens. Maybe she notices how much thicker the grass grows where her people have been camping. Maybe she sees how the seeds that fell near their hearths have sprouted into particularly robust plants. Whatever the moment of realization, she makes a decision that will change everything. Instead of simply gathering what nature provides, she deliberately plants some of the seeds she's collected, scratching small holes in the earth and covering them with soil. That simple act, repeated by countless individuals across different continents, represents one of the most profound transformations in human history. We call it the Neolithic Revolution, but revolution might not be the right word. It suggests something sudden, dramatic, explosive. The reality was far more gradual, far more tentative. It was more like a slow awakening, a gradual realization that humans didn't have to be entirely at the mercy of natural cycles. They could, within limits, begin to shape those cycles themselves. The first crops were nothing like the abundant harvests we know today. Wild wheat and barley produced tiny grains that were difficult to harvest and even harder to process. The seeds didn't fall off the plant cleanly when ripe, making collection a laborious process of beating the grass heads into baskets. Many of the grains were so hard they had to be ground between stones for hours just to make them edible. But even these modest yields represented something revolutionary. For the first time in human history, people could produce more food than they could immediately consume. They could create surpluses, store them for lean times, and begin to plan for the future in ways that had never been possible before. A successful harvest could sustain a community through winter months when hunting was poor and wild plants were dormant. The implications rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. If you could store food, you could support larger populations in smaller areas. If you could predict your food supply, you could invest time and energy in activities that weren't directly related to survival. If you could create surpluses, some members of your community could specialize in activities other than food production. These early agricultural communities weren't abandoning hunting and gathering entirely. Archaeological evidence shows that they continued to rely heavily on wild resources for thousands of years after they began cultivating crops. Agriculture was initially just one strategy among many, a way to supplement and stabilize food supplies rather than replace traditional subsistence methods entirely. The animals came next, though the process was equally gradual and probably equally accidental. Dogs had been companions to human hunters for thousands of years, probably descended from wolves that had learned to follow human bands and scavenge from their kills. But sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were different. These were prey animals that had to be captured, controlled, and bred in captivity. The process probably began with young animals orphaned during hunts. A hunter kills a mother goat and finds her kid bleating nearby. Instead of killing it immediately, maybe he brings it back to camp where children play with it and women feed it scraps. The young animal grows up around humans, becomes tame, eventually breeds. Over generations, the descendants of these accidentally domesticated animals become increasingly docile, increasingly dependent on human care. But there was more to it than just taming wild animals. The humans were changing too, developing new skills and knowledge that would have been useless to their Ice Age ancestors. They learned to read the subtle signs of plant health, to understand soil conditions, to predict weather patterns with much greater accuracy than nomadic hunters ever needed to. They developed new tools specifically for agricultural work, digging sticks for planting, sickles for harvesting, grinding stones for processing grain. These tools were heavier and more specialized than the portable toolkit of nomadic peoples, You couldn't carry a full set of agricultural implements while following herds across hundreds of miles of territory. The social changes were equally profound. Agricultural communities had to coordinate their activities in ways that nomadic bands never did. Everyone had to plant at roughly the same time to take advantage of optimal growing conditions. Harvests had to be organized collectively to bring in crops before they spoiled. Storage facilities had to be built and maintained cooperatively. These coordination requirements encouraged the development of more formal leadership structures. Someone had to decide when to plant, how to allocate land, how to distribute the harvest. These decisions affected the survival of the entire community, so they couldn't be left to chance or handled through the informal consensus building that worked for small nomadic groups. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural sites shows increasing social complexity and stratification. Houses become more varied in size and elaboration, suggesting that some families had access to more resources than others. Burials show greater disparities in grave goods, indicating that social distinctions were becoming more pronounced and permanent. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived in a world where the future was fundamentally unpredictable. You never knew when the herds would moving, and adapt to whatever circumstances, when the weather would turn bad, when resources you could do was stay flexible, keep would become scarce. The best arose. Agriculture changed this relationship with uncertainty. Farmers had to think ahead, plan for the future, invest time and energy in activities that wouldn't pay off for months. Nomadic ancestors. This psychological shift. They had to develop what anthropologists call delayed gratification on a scale that would have been impossible, for there had enormous implications for human culture and society. People who could plan for the agricultural cycle could also plan for other long-term projects. They could invest time in building permanent structures, creating elaborate art objects, developing complex technologies that required years of experimentation and refinement. The earliest agricultural settlements show evidence of this new long-term thinking everywhere you look. Houses built to last for decades rather than seasons. Storage facilities designed to preserve grain for years. Ceremonial structures that required coordinated effort from entire communities to construct. Some of the most impressive early agricultural sites, like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, consist almost entirely of ceremonial architecture. Massive stone pillars arranged in complex patterns, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. These structures would have required hundreds of people working together for years, coordinating their efforts across multiple growing seasons. The existence of such sites suggests that early agricultural communities were capable of organizing themselves for projects that went far beyond simple survival. They were investing collective labor in activities that served social, spiritual, or symbolic purposes, rather than immediate practical needs. This represents a fundamental shift in human priorities. Hunter-gatherer societies certainly had elaborate ritual and ceremonial lives, but they couldn't afford to devote large amounts of time and energy to non-productive activities. The margin for survival was too thin, the demands of daily life too pressing. Agricultural communities, with their ability to create and store surpluses, had the luxury of investing in activities that served social and cultural rather than purely economic functions. They could support individuals who specialized in ritual activities, artistic production, or the development of new technologies. The artistic traditions of early agricultural communities reflect this new freedom to invest in non-utilitarian activities. Pottery becomes increasingly elaborate and decorative. Textile production, made possible by domesticated sheep and flax, allows for the creation of clothing and other goods that are beautiful as well as functional. Religious and ceremonial practices also become more complex during this period. Archaeological sites contain evidence of increasingly elaborate burial practices, suggesting beliefs about the afterlife that are much more developed than anything seen in earlier periods. Ritual objects become more common and more sophisticated, indicating that spiritual life was becoming a more central part of community identity. But agriculture wasn't spreading uniformly across the world. Different regions were developing their own distinctive agricultural traditions based on locally available plants and animals. In the Middle East, wheat and barley were the primary crops, supplemented by lentils, peas, and other legumes. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were the main domesticated animals. In China, rice became the staple crop in the south, while millet dominated in the north. Pigs were the primary domesticated animal, though chickens and water buffalo were also important. In Mesoamerica, corn, beans, and squash formed the agricultural foundation, while llamas and alpacas were domesticated in the Andes. Each of these regional agricultural systems supported different types of social organization and cultural development. Rice cultivation in Asia required intensive cooperation to build and maintain irrigation systems, encouraging the development of centralized authority structures. Corn agriculture in the Americas could support dense populations, but required sophisticated knowledge of plant breeding to develop productive varieties. The diversity of these agricultural traditions is important because it shows that the transition from hunting and gathering to farming wasn't a single event, but a process that happened independently in multiple locations. Humans weren't just copying successful practices from other regions. They were innovating, experimenting, and developing new solutions to the challenges of food production. But this diversity also created new forms of inequality between different human populations. Communities that developed more productive agricultural systems could support larger populations, accumulate more resources, and invest more time and energy in developing new technologies. Over time, these advantages would compound, creating enormous disparities in power and wealth between different societies. The communities that successfully made the transition to agriculture weren't just more numerous than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. They were also more technologically sophisticated, better organized, and more capable of coordinating large-scale projects. When agricultural and hunter-gatherer societies came into contact, the results were usually devastating for the hunting and gathering peoples. This wasn't necessarily because agricultural peoples were more aggressive or warlike. In many cases, the differences in population density and disease resistance were enough to tip the balance decisively. Agricultural communities, living in close proximity to domesticated animals and their own waste products, had been exposed to many infectious diseases that were completely foreign to isolated hunter-gatherer populations. When these diseases spread to hunter-gatherer communities, they often caused catastrophic population crashes that made resistance to agricultural expansion impossible. Entire cultures and ways of life that had persisted for thousands of years vanished within a few generations of contact with agricultural peoples. But the spread of agriculture wasn't just about conquest and displacement. In many regions, hunter-gatherer communities gradually adopted agricultural practices themselves, integrating farming into their existing subsistence strategies rather than replacing them entirely. This process created hybrid societies that combined elements of both hunting-gathering and agricultural lifestyles. These transitional societies are particularly interesting because they show us that the shift to agriculture wasn't an inevitable or uniform process. Different communities made different choices about how much to rely on cultivated crops versus wild resources, how permanent their settlements should be, and how much social complexity they were willing to accept in exchange for agricultural productivity. Some groups remained primarily nomadic, but incorporated small-scale horticulture into their seasonal rounds. Others established permanent villages but continued to rely heavily on hunting and gathering for much of their food supply. Still others developed intensive agricultural systems but maintained relatively egalitarian social structures for centuries or even millennia. The archaeological record shows that these different strategies could be quite successful under the right circumstances. There was no single best way to organize an early agricultural society. Success depended on local environmental conditions, the availability of suitable plants and animals for domestication, and the particular historical circumstances that each community faced. But over the long term, the most intensive agricultural systems tended to expand at the expense of less intensive alternatives. Communities that could produce the largest surpluses could support the largest populations, which gave them advantages in both warfare and peaceful competition for resources. This process of agricultural intensification was driven not just by competition between different communities, but also by internal dynamics within agricultural societies themselves. As populations grew, communities were forced to extract more food from the same amount of land. This encouraged the development of new agricultural techniques, more efficient tools, and more sophisticated methods of land management. Irrigation systems began to appear in river valleys, where seasonal flooding could be controlled and directed. Terracing allowed farming on slopes that would otherwise have been too steep for cultivation. New varieties of crops were developed through selective breeding that were more productive, more resistant to disease, and better adapted to specific local conditions. Each of these innovations required greater investment of time, energy, and coordination than simpler agricultural methods. Building an irrigation system meant organizing hundreds of people to dig canals, construct dams, and maintain the entire network over many years. Terracing required moving enormous amounts of earth and stone to create level planting surfaces on mountainsides. These large-scale projects could only be accomplished by communities that had developed sophisticated systems of social organization and authority. Someone had to plan these projects, organize the labor required to build them, and ensure that they were properly maintained over time. This need for coordination and management encouraged the development of increasingly complex political institutions. The early agricultural period was thus a time of accelerating social evolution. Communities were not just learning to produce food more efficiently, they were also learning to organize themselves in entirely new ways. The small egalitarian bands that had characterized human society for hundreds of thousands of years were giving way to larger, more hierarchical communities with specialized roles and formal leadership structures. This transformation wasn't always smooth or peaceful. Archaeological evidence from many early agricultural sites shows signs of conflict, destruction, and rebuilding. As communities grew larger and more complex, they also became more vulnerable to internal disputes and external attacks. The surpluses that made complex society possible also made these communities attractive targets for raiders and conquerors. But despite these challenges, the agricultural revolution continued to spread and intensify. By 5,000 years ago, large agricultural populations existed on every inhabited continent. The stage was set for the next great transformation in human history, the rise of cities, states, and civilizations. The transition from small agricultural villages to complex urban societies would happen remarkably quickly once the process began, but it was built on the foundation laid during the long, slow agricultural revolution that had been underway for thousands of years. Every technique for growing crops, every method of storing surplus food, every system for organizing collective labor had been developed and refined by countless generations of early farmers. Without understanding this agricultural foundation, it's impossible to appreciate how extraordinary the emergence of civilization really was. Cities, writing systems, monumental architecture, complex political institutions, all of these developments were made possible by the surplus production that agriculture allowed. But they were also the culmination of a process of social and technological innovation that had been building for millennia. As we stand on the threshold of exploring how these first agricultural communities grew into the earliest cities and states, it's worth remembering that we're still living with the consequences of choices made by those early farmers. The crops we eat, the animals we raise, even many of the social institutions we take for granted, all trace their origins back to those experimental communities that first decided to plant seeds and tend flocks in the warming world that emerged from the Ice Age. The story of how agriculture transformed human society is far from over. In fact, we might argue that we're still in the middle of it, still grappling with the social and environmental consequences of that first decision to plant seeds, rather than simply gather what nature provided. But that's a story that extends far beyond the scope of our journey through the Ice Age and its aftermath. For now, it's enough to appreciate the extraordinary chain of events that connected the retreat of the glaciers to the planting of the first crops. From the massive environmental changes that ended the Ice Age to the social innovations that made agriculture possible, every link in that chain was essential to creating the world we inhabit today. The Ice Age didn't just shape the physical landscape we live on, it also shaped the trajectory of human development in ways that continue to influence our lives thousands of years later. The skills our ancestors developed to survive in that frozen world, the social institutions they created to coordinate their activities, even the psychological adaptations that allowed them to plan for uncertain futures, all contributed to making the agricultural revolution possible. And the agricultural revolution, in turn, set the stage for everything that followed. Cities, empires, technologies, art forms, philosophical traditions. All of these emerged from the surplus production and social complexity that agriculture made possible. In a very real sense, the modern world began in those small experimental plots, where our ancestors first learned to plant seeds and tend crops in the rich soils left behind by the retreating glaciers. The transformation from scattered agricultural villages to the first true cities represents one of the most dramatic leaps in human development. Picture this. Around 6,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something unprecedented was happening. Communities that had numbered in the hundreds were growing into settlements of thousands, then tens of thousands of people. These weren't just larger villages. They were entirely new forms of human organization, complex urban centers that would have been utterly alien to the Ice Age hunters who had roamed these same lands just a few millennia earlier. The driving force behind this urban revolution was surplus. Those early farmers in Mesopotamia had become incredibly good at what they did. Their irrigation systems could channel river water across vast areas of previously barren land. Their crop varieties, refined through generations of selective breeding, produced yields that would have seemed miraculous to their ancestors. A single family could now grow enough food to feed not just themselves, but several other families as well. This surplus created possibilities that had never existed before in human history. For the first time, large numbers of people could survive without directly producing their own food. They could specialize in other activities, crafts, trade, religious ceremonies, administration, warfare. The division of labor that had begun in small agricultural communities suddenly exploded into a complex web of interdependent specializations. Imagine walking through one of these early cities, say Uruk, around 3500 BCE. The sensory overload would be immediate and overwhelming. The narrow streets buzz with activity, unlike anything seen in the quieter agricultural villages of previous centuries. Potters work at their wheels, shaping clay into vessels of increasing sophistication and beauty. Metalworkers tend fires hot enough to melt copper and bronze, hammering out tools and weapons that gleam with a luster no stone implement could match. Textile workers spin wool into thread and weave it into fabrics dyed in brilliant colors derived from plants and minerals. Bakers work massive ovens that can feed hundreds of people at once. Brewers ferment grain into alcoholic beverages that have become central to both daily life and religious ceremony. The air is thick with smoke from countless fires. The sounds of hammering, grinding, shouting, and singing blend into a constant urban symphony. But perhaps most remarkably, there are people whose only job is to think, to remember, and to organize. Scribes sit in the shadows of temples, scratching marks onto clay tablets. These marks aren't just decorations or simple pictures. They're something entirely new in human history. Writing, a system for recording information outside of human memory, for preserving knowledge across generations, for coordinating complex activities across space and time. The development of writing was perhaps the single most important innovation of the urban revolution. It solved a problem that had been building for centuries as human societies became more complex. How do you keep track of increasingly complicated economic and social relationships? How do you record who owns what, who owes whom, when taxes are due? What laws have been established? The earliest writing systems emerged directly from the practical needs of urban administration. Merchants needed to record transactions. Temple administrators needed to track offerings and distribute rations. Rulers needed to codify laws and issue decrees. What began as simple accounting systems gradually evolved into more sophisticated methods for recording everything from poetry to historical chronicles. But writing did more than just solve practical problems. It fundamentally changed how humans could think about themselves and their world. For the first time, ideas could be preserved exactly as they were formulated, examined, debated, and refined across generations. Knowledge could accumulate in ways that had been impossible when everything depended on human memory and oral tradition. The social implications were staggering. In hunter-gatherer societies, everyone had essentially the same relationship to information. Knowledge was shared communally, passed down through stories, songs, and demonstrations. But writing created new forms of inequality. Those who could read and write had access to information that was completely unavailable to the illiterate majority. This literacy divide became one of the fundamental sources of power in early urban societies. Scribes, priests, and administrators formed a new kind of elite, one based not just on control of resources but on control of information itself. They were the ones who could read the laws, interpret religious texts, maintain commercial records, and communicate with distant cities. The temples that dominated these early cities weren't just religious centers. They were the first large-scale institutions in human history, complex organizations that coordinated the activities of thousands of people. They served simultaneously as religious sanctuaries, economic centers, administrative headquarters, and cultural institutions. Temple complexes controlled vast amounts of agricultural land worked by dependent laborers. They operated workshops that produced everything from textiles to metalwork. They maintained schools where scribes learned to read and write. They housed libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of their civilizations. They even operated what were essentially the world's first banks, lending grain and silver to merchants and farmers. The priests who ran these institutions weren't just spiritual leaders. They were some of the most powerful people in their societies, controllers of wealth and information on a scale that would have been unimaginable in earlier periods. They developed elaborate theological systems that justified their authority and complex ritual practices that reinforced social hierarchies. But religious authority wasn't the only form of power emerging in these early cities. Military leaders, successful merchants, and skilled administrators also accumulated wealth and influence. The relatively egalitarian communities of the agricultural period were giving way to societies with sharp distinctions between rulers and subjects, rich and poor, free and enslaved. Warfare became increasingly important as cities competed for resources and territory. The surplus production that made urban civilization possible also made these cities attractive targets for raiders and conquerors. Defensive walls, professional armies, and sophisticated weapons became necessary for survival. The scale of these conflicts was unprecedented. Instead of small skirmishes between hunting bands or raids on agricultural villages, wars now involved thousands of soldiers, siege equipment capable of breaching massive fortifications, and battles that could determine the fate of entire civilizations. Victory in these conflicts brought enormous rewards. Conquered cities could be forced to pay tribute, their populations enslaved, their resources redirected to benefit the victors. This created incentives for military expansion that would drive the formation of the first empires. Trade networks also expanded dramatically during this period. Cities needed resources that weren't available locally: metals for tools and weapons, stones for construction, luxury goods that demonstrated the wealth and power of their elites. Merchants developed increasingly sophisticated methods for transporting goods across vast distances and for negotiating exchanges between cultures with completely different languages and customs. These trade networks weren't just about moving objects from place to place. They were also conduits for the spread of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Innovations developed in one city could spread across entire continents through these commercial connections. Writing systems, metallurgical techniques, agricultural methods, and artistic styles all diffused along trade routes. The wealth that flowed through these networks allowed for investments in monumental architecture on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, massive stone temples and palaces that required the coordinated labor of thousands of workers over many years to complete. These monuments served multiple purposes. They were expressions of religious devotion, demonstrations of political power, and statements about the permanence and importance of the communities that built them. But they were also massive public works projects that helped organize and employ urban populations during periods when agricultural work was less demanding. The construction of these monuments required new forms of engineering and mathematical knowledge. Architects had to understand principles of structural engineering that went far beyond anything needed for simple houses or storage buildings. They had to coordinate the work of numerous specialized craftsmen, plan supply chains for materials that might come from hundreds of miles away, and organize labor forces that could number in the tens of thousands. This technical knowledge was closely guarded by professional guilds and priestly classes. The secrets of bronze making, the techniques for quarrying and moving massive stone blocks, the mathematical formulas for calculating structural loads, all of this represented forms of specialized knowledge that gave their possessors enormous power and influence. Educational institutions began to emerge to preserve and transmit this knowledge. Schools attached to temples taught not just basic literacy and numeracy, but also specialized skills in law, engineering, medicine, and astronomy. These schools produced the first professional classes in human history, people whose entire careers were based on mastery of complex bodies of theoretical and practical knowledge. The emergence of these professional classes had profound implications for social mobility and cultural development. For the first time in human history, it became possible for individuals to rise in status based on their intellectual abilities rather than just their physical strength, family connections, or accumulated wealth. A talented student from a humble background could potentially become a respected scribe, engineer, or administrator. At the same time, this specialization created new forms of social fragmentation. Urban societies became increasingly divided into distinct occupational groups with their own customs, interests, and identities. Potters, metalworkers, merchants, soldiers, priests, farmers, and administrators all developed their own subcultures within the larger urban community. These occupational identities often became hereditary, passed down from parents to children, along with the specialized knowledge and social connections needed for success. What had begun as flexible specialization gradually hardened into rigid caste systems that limited individual mobility and reinforced social inequalities. Legal systems also became more complex during this period. Simple customary law that could be remembered and applied by community elders gave way to elaborate written codes that specified punishments for numerous different offences. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1750 BCE, contains nearly 300 different laws covering everything from commercial disputes to family relationships to criminal penalties. These legal codes weren't just lists of rules. They were attempts to create systematic approaches to justice that could be applied consistently across large and diverse populations. They established the principle that laws should be publicly known and uniformly enforced, concepts that would become fundamental to later legal traditions. But the legal systems of early cities also institutionalized many forms of inequality that would persist for millennia. Punishments varied dramatically depending on the social status of both perpetrator and victim. Slaves, women, and members of lower social classes had fewer legal protections and faced harsher penalties for the same offences as their social superiors. Despite these inequalities, early urban societies were remarkably innovative and dynamic. The concentration of large numbers of people in small areas created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual and cultural exchange. Ideas that might have developed slowly in isolated agricultural communities could spread rapidly through urban populations. This intellectual ferment produced remarkable advances in numerous fields. Astronomy developed from the practical need to create accurate calendars for agricultural and religious purposes. Mathematics emerged from the requirements of commerce, construction, and administration. Medicine began to move beyond purely magical approaches as urban healers gained experience treating large numbers of patients with similar conditions. Artistic traditions also flourished in urban environments. The wealth of urban elites provided patronage for skilled craftsmen who could devote their entire careers to perfecting their techniques. The concentration of workshops in cities allowed for rapid innovation and the development of increasingly sophisticated artistic styles. Literature began to emerge as writing systems became more flexible and expressive. The earliest written texts had been purely utilitarian, records of transactions and administrative decisions. But gradually, scribes began using writing to preserve stories, poems, and religious texts that had previously existed only in oral tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, represents one of the earliest examples of literature in the modern sense. It's not just a collection of myths or a historical chronicle, but a sophisticated narrative that explores themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning that still resonate with readers today. These literary works weren't just entertainment for urban elites. They helped create shared cultural identities that could unite diverse urban populations. People who spoke different languages, followed different occupations, and worshipped different gods could still identify as members of the same civilization through shared stories and cultural traditions. Religious systems also became more elaborate and institutionalized during this period. The simple animistic beliefs that had characterized hunter-gatherer societies evolved into complex theological systems with elaborate mythologies, formal priesthoods, and magnificent temples. These religions served important social functions, providing moral frameworks that helped maintain order in large and diverse urban populations. But they also became tools of political control. Rulers claimed divine sanction for their authority, presented themselves as representatives or even incarnations of the gods, and used religious ceremonies to reinforce social hierarchies and political allegiances. The relationship between political and religious authority varied considerably between different urban civilizations. In some cities, priests wielded supreme power, and rulers served essentially as their secular administrators. In others, military leaders or successful merchants took control and reduced religious institutions to supporting roles in their political systems. These different approaches to organizing urban society led to the development of distinct civilizational traditions that would influence human development for thousands of years. The city-states of Mesopotamia developed different political systems than the unified kingdoms of Egypt. The trade-based societies of the Eastern Mediterranean evolved different cultural values than the agricultural empires of China and India. But despite these differences, all early urban civilizations faced similar challenges and developed similar solutions. They all had to find ways to organize large populations, coordinate complex economic activities, maintain order and security, and preserve and transmit cultural knowledge across generations. The solutions they developed: writing systems, legal codes, professional armies, educational institutions, monumental architecture, complex religious systems, established patterns that would be repeated and refined by later civilizations around the world. The urban revolution that began in a few river valleys 6,000 years ago ultimately transformed the entire planet. Looking back from our modern perspective, it's tempting to see this transformation as inevitable progress toward increasingly complex and sophisticated forms of human organization. But the people living through it would have experienced it very differently. For many, the transition from agricultural villages to urban civilization probably felt like a loss of freedom and community rather than an advance toward a better way of life. Urban life required unprecedented levels of coordination and submission to authority. People who had been accustomed to the seasonal rhythms of agricultural work found themselves subject to the constant demands of urban labor. Individuals who had grown up in small communities where everyone knew everyone else found themselves anonymous members of vast and impersonal urban populations. The environmental costs were also significant. Early cities consumed resources at rates that quickly exhausted their immediate surroundings. They required constant inputs of food, fuel, and raw materials from increasingly distant sources. They produced waste and pollution on scales that had never been seen before in human history. Some agricultural communities actively resisted urbanization, maintaining their traditional ways of life even as cities grew around them. Others were incorporated into urban systems against their will, their resources appropriated to support urban populations, their young people drawn away by the opportunities and excitement of city life. But despite these costs and resistance, urbanization proved unstoppable once it began. The advantages that cities provided in terms of military power, economic productivity, and cultural innovation were too great for purely agricultural societies to match. Within a few thousand years, urban civilizations had spread across most of the inhabited world. The process wasn't uniform or linear. Cities rose and fell. Civilizations collapsed and were replaced by new ones. Technological and cultural innovations were sometimes lost and had to be redeveloped centuries later. But the overall trajectory was clear. Human societies were becoming larger, more complex, and more interconnected. This process of urbanization and civilization represented the final major transformation in the long journey that had begun with the retreat of the glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. From the warming climate that made agriculture possible, to the agricultural surplus that enabled urban life, to the urban innovations that laid the foundations for all later human development, each step had built upon the previous ones in ways that would have been impossible to predict or plan. The world that emerged from this process was radically different from the one our Ice Age ancestors had known. Instead of small bands of hunters following herds across vast grasslands, there were now millions of people living in permanent settlements, connected by trade networks that spanned continents, governed by complex institutions, and engaged in activities that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. Yet in many ways, the fundamental challenges remained the same. Humans still had to find ways to survive and thrive in environments that were often harsh and unpredictable. They still had to cooperate with others, share resources, and coordinate their activities to achieve goals that no individual could accomplish alone. They still had to adapt to changing circumstances and find innovative solutions to unprecedented problems. The difference was in the scale and complexity of these challenges. Instead of small groups adapting to local environmental changes, entire civilizations now had to coordinate their responses to regional or even global disruptions. Instead of individuals learning the skills needed for survival in specific environments, societies had to create institutions capable of preserving and transmitting vast bodies of specialized knowledge across generations. The story of how humans met these challenges, how they built the first cities and states and empires, how they developed the technologies and institutions that would eventually transform the entire planet, is in many ways still unfolding. The urban revolution that began 6,000 years ago set in motion processes of change that continue to shape our world today. Understanding this long historical trajectory helps us appreciate both how far human societies have come and how recent many of our most basic institutions really are. The cities we live in, the technologies we depend on, the forms of government that organize our societies, all trace their origins back to those first experimental urban communities that emerged in the river valleys of the ancient world. But it also helps us understand that the path from the Ice Age to the modern world wasn't inevitable or predetermined. At every step along the way, humans made choices about how to organize their societies, what values to prioritize, and what kinds of futures to build. The world we inhabit today is the result of countless such decisions, made by individuals and communities facing challenges that were often unprecedented in human experience. As we continue to grapple with the consequences of our urban, technological civilization, from climate change to social inequality to the management of increasingly complex global systems, it's worth remembering that our ancestors faced similar challenges of adaptation and innovation. They found ways to survive and thrive through some of the most dramatic environmental and social changes in human history. Their story, from the frozen mammoth steppes of the Ice Age to the bustling streets of the first cities, reminds us that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. We've survived ice ages and global warming, the extinction of megafauna and the rise of agriculture, the collapse of hunting and gathering societies, and the emergence of urban civilization. Each of these transformations required new forms of cooperation, new technologies, and new ways of understanding ourselves and our place in the world. Each time, our ancestors found ways to meet these challenges, though not without costs and not without leaving some people and communities behind. As we face our own unprecedented challenges in the 21st century, we can draw inspiration from this long history of human adaptation and innovation. We are the descendants of people who survived the Ice Age, who invented agriculture, who built the first cities, and who created the foundations of everything we now take for granted. Their legacy isn't just in the institutions and technologies they created, but in the knowledge that humans can adapt to even the most dramatic changes when they work together and when they're willing to innovate and experiment with new solutions to old problems. The journey from the Ice Age to the urban revolution was long and difficult, marked by both triumphs and tragedies, both remarkable achievements and devastating losses. But it was also the journey that made us who we are today, that gave us the tools and knowledge we need to continue adapting to an ever-changing world. In the end, that may be the most important lesson we can learn from our Ice Age ancestors and the civilizations they eventually built. That change is the only constant in human history, and that our greatest strength as a species lies not in our ability to control that change, but in our capacity to adapt to it creatively and cooperatively. The world that emerged from these first urban experiments was one of constant motion and transformation. Trade routes stretched like arteries across continents, carrying not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and entire ways of thinking from one civilization to another. An innovation in metallurgy developed in Anatolia might find its way to the Indus Valley within a few generations. A new form of writing created in Mesopotamia could influence scribal traditions across the Eastern Mediterranean. These connections weren't just about commerce, though trade was certainly the driving force. They represented something entirely new in human experience, the first truly global networks of communication and exchange. For hundreds of thousands of years, human communities had been largely isolated from one another, developing their own distinct cultures and technologies in relative independence. Now, for the first time, innovations could spread rapidly across vast distances, creating a kind of collective human intelligence that operated on a planetary scale. The psychological impact of this interconnectedness was profound. People living in early cities weren't just members of their local communities anymore. They were part of something larger, a web of relationships and dependencies that stretched far beyond anything they could see or directly experience. A farmer in ancient Egypt might wear jewelry made from lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan. A merchant in the Indus Valley might use writing techniques originally developed in Mesopotamia. This awareness of being part of a larger world changed how people thought about themselves and their place in the universe. Local gods and traditions remained important, but they were increasingly understood within broader cosmological frameworks that attempted to make sense of the entire known world. Creation myths became more elaborate and systematic, trying to explain not just the origins of particular peoples, but the structure of reality itself. Religious systems began to grapple with questions that would have been meaningless to earlier generations. If there were many different peoples with many different gods, which ones were real? How should different religious traditions relate to one another? What did it mean for a person to be part of a particular culture when that culture was constantly interacting with and being influenced by others? Some cities attempted to resolve these questions by creating syncretic religious systems that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. Others became more aggressively exclusive, insisting that their particular gods and practices were superior to all others. Still others developed philosophical approaches that tried to find universal principles underlying the apparent diversity of human beliefs and practices. These religious and philosophical developments weren't just abstract intellectual exercises. They had real-world implications for how cities related to one another, how they treated foreigners and minorities, and how they justified their political and military actions. A city that believed its gods were superior to all others might feel justified in conquering and converting its neighbors. One that embraced religious diversity might become a cosmopolitan center that attracted merchants and scholars from across the known world. The competition between different urban centers also drove remarkable innovations in military technology and tactics. The simple weapons that had served Ice Age hunters were completely inadequate for the large-scale conflicts that increasingly defined relations between cities. Bronze weapons gave way to iron ones. Individual warriors were organized into disciplined formations. Siege engines were developed that could breach the most formidable fortifications. But warfare wasn't just about technology. It was also about organization, logistics, and strategy on scales that had never been attempted before. Moving thousands of soldiers across hundreds of miles of territory required unprecedented levels of planning and coordination. Supplying armies in the field meant developing new methods for preserving and transporting food. Maintaining discipline and morale among large numbers of men, drawn from diverse backgrounds, required new forms of military culture and leadership. The most successful military innovations weren't just copied by neighboring cities. They spread throughout entire regions within a few generations. The chariot warfare that dominated Bronze Age battlefields probably originated in the steppes of Central Asia, but quickly spread to every major civilization from China to Egypt. Ironworking, which gave armies decisive advantages over those still using bronze weapons, diffused even more rapidly once the techniques became known. These military innovations had cascading effects throughout society. Cities that could field more effective armies could extract tribute from their neighbors, control larger territories, and access more resources. This allowed them to support even larger populations, invest in even more sophisticated technologies, and project power over even greater distances. The result was a process of political consolidation that transformed the landscape of early civilization. The small, independent city-states that had characterized the first urban period gradually gave way to larger territorial kingdoms and eventually to vast empires that controlled multiple regions and peoples. This imperial expansion created new challenges that required even more sophisticated forms of organization and administration. How do you govern territories that are too large for direct personal control? How do you maintain loyalty among diverse populations that speak different languages and follow different customs? How do you extract resources from distant provinces without triggering rebellions? Different civilizations develop different solutions to these problems, and their successes and failures shape the course of human development for millennia to come. Some empires relied primarily on military force, maintaining control through the constant threat of violence. Others developed more sophisticated administrative systems that could govern through law and bureaucracy rather than pure coercion. The most successful empires learned to balance central control with local autonomy, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their own traditions and institutions while ensuring their loyalty to imperial authority. This required unprecedented levels of cultural and political sophistication, the ability to understand and work with radically different ways of life, while maintaining the unity and coherence of the larger imperial system. The Persian Empire, which at its height stretched from India to Egypt to the borders of Europe, pioneered many of the administrative techniques that would be refined and perfected by later imperial powers. They developed standardized systems of weights and measures that facilitated trade across vast distances. They built roads and communication networks that allowed messages and resources to move efficiently throughout their territories. They created provincial administrative systems that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining imperial oversight. But perhaps most importantly, they developed ideological frameworks that could justify and sustain imperial rule over diverse populations. Instead of simply imposing their own culture on conquered peoples, they presented themselves as universal rulers whose authority derived from divine mandate to bring order and justice to the entire world. This imperial ideology wasn't just propaganda, though it certainly served that function. It represented a genuinely new way of thinking about political authority and social organization. Instead of the particularistic loyalties that had characterized earlier forms of government, imperial systems demanded more abstract forms of allegiance based on shared participation in larger civilizational projects. Citizens of these early empires weren't just members of particular ethnic or tribal groups. They were participants in universal systems of law, culture, and belief that transcended local identities. This didn't mean that local traditions disappeared, but they were increasingly understood as variations within larger imperial frameworks, rather than as completely independent alternatives. The cultural implications of this transformation were enormous. Art, literature, and intellectual traditions that had developed in isolation began to interact and influence one another in unprecedented ways. Greek philosophy encountered Persian religion. Indian mathematics met Mesopotamian astronomy. Egyptian medical knowledge combined with Chinese herbal traditions. These cultural exchanges weren't always peaceful or voluntary. Imperial expansion often involved the destruction of local traditions and the forced adoption of imperial cultures. But they also created opportunities for innovation and synthesis that would have been impossible in a world of isolated communities. The great libraries and schools of the ancient world became centers of learning that drew scholars from across the known world. The Library of Alexandria, the Academy in Athens, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. These institutions represented humanity's first attempts to create truly universal repositories of knowledge that could preserve and transmit the intellectual achievements of all cultures. The scholars who worked in these institutions weren't just preserving existing knowledge. They were actively synthesizing different traditions, comparing different approaches to similar problems, and developing new methods of inquiry that combined insights from multiple sources. This intellectual synthesis produced some of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that allowed for accurate prediction of eclipses and the calculation of the Earth's circumference. The medical understanding that made possible the first systematic approaches to surgery and pharmacology. the geographical knowledge that enabled long-distance navigation, and the mapping of previously unknown territories. But these intellectual achievements were built on more than just the accumulation of factual knowledge. They represented new ways of thinking about the world that emphasized systematic observation, logical reasoning, and the testing of theories against empirical evidence. These intellectual methods weren't just academic exercises. They had practical applications that transformed everyday life for millions of people. Better agricultural techniques increased crop yields and reduced the risk of famine. Improved construction methods made possible larger and more durable buildings. Advances in metallurgy produced better tools and weapons. The economic implications of these technological advances were profound. Increased agricultural productivity could support larger urban populations, which in turn provided larger markets for manufactured goods and more workers for specialized industries. Better transportation technologies reduced the costs of long-distance trade and made possible the development of even more extensive commercial networks. The wealth generated by these economic developments allowed for unprecedented investments in public works and cultural projects. The great monuments of the ancient world, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temples of Greece, weren't just expressions of religious devotion or political power. They were also massive economic enterprises that employed thousands of workers and required the coordination of resources from across entire empires. These construction projects served multiple functions within ancient societies. They provided employment for large numbers of people during periods when agricultural work was less demanding. They demonstrated the wealth and power of rulers to both their own subjects and foreign observers. They created lasting symbols of cultural identity that could unite diverse populations around shared projects and achievements. But perhaps most importantly, they required the development of increasingly sophisticated technical knowledge and organizational capabilities. The engineering expertise needed to build a pyramid or a great temple had applications far beyond monumental architecture. The mathematical knowledge required for these projects could be applied to problems of taxation, land measurement, and resource allocation. The organizational skills needed to coordinate thousands of workers over many years could be applied to military campaigns, trade expeditions, and administrative challenges. In many ways, these great construction projects served as training grounds for the kinds of large-scale coordination that imperial governments required. As these ancient civilizations matured and their territories expanded, they began to encounter each other more frequently and intensively. The isolated development that had characterized the early urban period gave way to increasingly complex patterns of interaction, competition, and exchange. Sometimes these encounters were peaceful, leading to profitable trade relationships and beneficial cultural exchanges. Greek merchants established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. Chinese silk found its way to Roman markets via trade routes that stretched across Central Asia. Indian spices and precious stones were prized in courts from Persia to Egypt. But these encounters could also be violent and destructive. The expansion of different empires inevitably led to conflicts over territory and resources. The Persian Wars between Greece and Persia, the conquests of Alexander the Great, the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. These conflicts weren't just military campaigns. They were clashes between different civilizational systems, different ways of organizing society and understanding the world. The outcomes of these conflicts had lasting consequences for the development of human civilization. The Greek victory over Persia preserved the independence of the Greek city-states and allowed for the continued development of Greek philosophy, science, and democratic institutions. Alexander's conquests spread Greek culture throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia, creating the cosmopolitan Hellenistic civilization that would dominate these regions for centuries. The Roman victory over Carthage established Roman dominance in the Western Mediterranean and set the stage for the creation of an empire that would eventually encompass most of the known world. The fall of Rome would later create opportunities for the rise of new civilizational centers in Byzantium, Baghdad, and eventually Western Europe. Each of these civilizational transitions involved not just changes in political control, but fundamental transformations in how people understood themselves and their world. The spread of Greek culture during the Hellenistic period introduced new forms of art, literature, and philosophy to peoples who had previously been isolated from Greek influence. The expansion of Roman law created new concepts of citizenship and legal rights that would influence political development for centuries to come. These civilizational exchanges weren't just one-way processes. Greek culture was transformed by its encounter with Persian and Egyptian traditions. Roman civilization incorporated elements from all the peoples they conquered, from Celtic military techniques to Germanic legal customs to Middle Eastern religious practices. The result was a kind of cultural evolution that operated on a global scale, with successful innovations spreading rapidly throughout interconnected civilizational networks, while less successful approaches were abandoned or modified. This process accelerated the pace of human development in ways that would have been impossible if different civilizations had remained isolated from one another. But this interconnectedness also created new vulnerabilities. Civilizations that had become dependent on long-distance trade could be severely disrupted by political instability in distant regions. Diseases that had been confined to particular populations could now spread rapidly along trade routes, causing devastating epidemics. Military innovations developed by one civilization could quickly be adopted by its enemies, leading to arms races that consumed enormous resources. The collapse of major civilizational centers could have cascading effects throughout entire regions. When the Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed around 1200 BCE, the disruption affected trade networks and political systems, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Similarly, the fall of the Roman Empire in the West created opportunities for new civilizational developments in Europe, while also leading to centuries of political fragmentation and economic decline. These cycles of rise and fall, expansion and collapse, weren't just political phenomena. They reflected deeper patterns in how human societies develop and adapt to changing circumstances. Successful civilizations tend to become increasingly complex and sophisticated, but this very complexity can make them more vulnerable to disruption when faced with unprecedented challenges. The environmental costs of civilizational development also became more apparent as these ancient societies matured. Intensive agriculture could lead to soil exhaustion and erosion. Large urban populations could overwhelm local water supplies and create serious pollution problems. Deforestation to supply fuel and building materials could alter local climates and ecosystems. Some civilizations learned to manage these environmental challenges more successfully than others. The ancient Egyptians developed agricultural techniques that could maintain soil fertility for thousands of years by working with the natural flooding cycles of the Nile River. Some Mesopotamian cities created sophisticated irrigation systems that could sustain intensive agriculture for centuries. But other civilizations were less successful in managing their environmental impacts. The collapse of some ancient cities may have been caused in part by environmental degradation that made continued occupation impossible. The lesson that emerged from these experiences was that sustainable civilization required not just sophisticated technology and complex social organization, but also careful attention to the long-term environmental consequences of human activities. As we look back on these ancient civilizations from our modern perspective, we can see both remarkable achievements and sobering warnings. The intellectual and technological innovations of the ancient world laid the foundations for everything that would follow. The political and legal institutions they developed established principles of governance that continue to influence modern societies. But we can also see the costs of rapid civilizational development, the social inequalities that emerged with urban life, the environmental degradation that accompanied intensive resource extraction, the cycles of warfare and conquest that caused enormous suffering, while also driving technological and political innovation. Perhaps most importantly, we can see that the transformation from Ice Age hunting societies to complex urban civilizations wasn't inevitable or predetermined. At every stage, people made choices about how to organize their societies, what values to prioritize, and what kinds of futures to build toward. The world that emerged from these choices was neither utopian nor dystopian, but something more complex and ambiguous. It was a world of unprecedented opportunities for human creativity and achievement, but also one of new forms of inequality and environmental challenge. It was a world where individual lives could be enriched by participation in great cultural and intellectual traditions, but also one where those same traditions could be used to justify oppression and exploitation. Understanding this history helps us appreciate both the remarkable achievements of our ancestors and the ongoing challenges we face as inheritors of their civilizational legacy. The urban revolution that began 6,000 years ago created the foundations of the modern world, but it also initiated processes of change that we're still grappling with today. The question we face now is whether we can learn from both the successes and failures of these ancient civilizations to create forms of social organization that are both sustainable and just. The Ice Age hunters who survived in frozen mammoth steppes, the early farmers who learned to cultivate wild grasses, the first city builders who created writing and law and monumental architecture. All of them faced unprecedented challenges that required new forms of cooperation and innovation. We face our own unprecedented challenges today, from climate change to global inequality to the management of planetary-scale technological systems. But we also inherit from our ancestors the knowledge that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of creating new solutions to even the most daunting problems when they work together with creativity and determination. The long journey from the Ice Age to the first civilizations shows us that change is the only constant in human history, and that our greatest strength as a species lies not in our ability to control that change, but in our capacity to adapt to it thoughtfully and cooperatively. As we continue to grapple with the consequences of our civilizational inheritance, we can draw inspiration from this long history of human adaptation and innovation. We are the descendants of people who survived ice ages and invented agriculture, who built the first cities and created the first writing systems, who developed the first law codes and the first global trade networks. Their legacy isn't just in the institutions and technologies they created, but in the knowledge that humans can rise to meet even the most extraordinary challenges when they combine individual creativity with collective purpose. That knowledge, perhaps more than any specific achievement, may be their most important gift to us as we work to create a sustainable and equitable future for all humanity. The story of human civilization is still being written, and we are both its authors and its characters. The choices we make today about how to organize our societies, what values to prioritize, and what kind of future to build will shape the world for generations to come. In making those choices, we can learn much from the long journey that brought us from the frozen mammoth steppes to the bustling cities of the ancient world, and from there to the complex global civilization we inhabit today. The echoes of that ancient transformation still ripple through our world today in ways most of us never pause to consider. Walk through any modern city and you're retracing paths first carved by those early urban pioneers. The grid systems that organize our streets, the specialized districts where different trades cluster together, even the basic concept of zoning for residential versus commercial use. All of these trace their origins back to those first experimental cities rising from the Mesopotamian plains. But it's not just the physical layout of our urban spaces that carries these ancient fingerprints. The very rhythms of modern life still echo patterns established thousands of years ago. The work week that structures our calendars, the seasonal festivals that mark our years, the educational systems that prepare our children for specialized careers. All of these emerged from the practical necessities of those early urban communities, trying to coordinate increasingly complex activities across large populations. Think about something as simple as money. Before cities, wealth meant tangible things you could hold, use, or eat. Surplus grain, well-crafted tools, healthy livestock. But urban societies needed ways to represent value that could be stored, transported, and exchanged efficiently across long distances and between strangers who might never meet again. The solution was to create abstract symbols of worth, metal coins, and written contracts that represented value without being inherently valuable themselves. This shift from concrete to abstract thinking wasn't just economic. It permeated every aspect of how people understood their world. Instead of simply accepting the natural cycles they observed, urban peoples began to create systematic explanations for why things happened the way they did. They developed mathematics to describe relationships between quantities, astronomy to predict celestial events, and philosophy to explore the fundamental nature of existence itself. These intellectual frameworks weren't just academic exercises confined to elite scholars. They had practical applications that transformed daily life in ways that are still influencing us today. The mathematical principles developed for urban construction and trade became the foundation for engineering projects that could span continents. The astronomical observations made by ancient priests trying to create accurate calendars eventually enabled navigation across open oceans and the mapping of previously unknown lands. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in how people understood time itself. Hunter-gatherer societies had lived primarily in the present, responding to immediate needs and seasonal cycles. Early agricultural communities had extended their temporal horizons to include annual planting and harvest cycles. But urban civilizations began to think in terms of decades, centuries, and even millennia. This long-term perspective made possible projects and institutions that would have been inconceivable to earlier generations. Legal codes that were intended to govern behavior for centuries to come. Educational systems designed to preserve knowledge across multiple generations. Architectural projects that would take decades to complete, but were expected to stand for thousands of years. The psychological impact of this expanded temporal consciousness was enormous. People began to see themselves not just as individuals trying to survive in the present, but as links in chains of inheritance and obligation that stretched both backwards to their ancestors and forwards to their descendants. This sense of historical continuity provided meaning and purpose that transcended immediate personal needs. It also created new forms of responsibility and anxiety. If your actions could have consequences that lasted for generations, then the stakes of every decision became much higher. Urban peoples developed elaborate systems of ethics and law designed to help individuals navigate these expanded moral landscapes. They created rituals and ceremonies intended to connect the living with the dead and the unborn. Religious systems evolved to address these new temporal concerns. Instead of focusing primarily on immediate practical needs, like successful hunts or favorable weather, urban religions began to grapple with ultimate questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. They developed sophisticated theologies that attempted to explain not just how the world worked, but why it existed at all and what humans' place in it was supposed to be. These theological developments weren't just abstract speculation. They had real-world implications for how societies organized themselves and how individuals conducted their daily lives. Religious institutions became some of the most powerful organizations in urban societies, controlling vast resources and wielding enormous influence over political and social development. But they also became repositories of knowledge and culture that helped preserve human achievements across the inevitable cycles of political rise and fall. When empires collapsed and cities were abandoned, religious institutions often provided the continuity that allowed civilizational knowledge to survive and eventually re-emerge in new forms. The interplay between religious and secular authority became one of the defining characteristics of urban civilization. Sometimes these two forms of power worked together harmoniously, with rulers claiming divine sanction and priests providing ideological support for political authority. Other times they came into conflict, leading to struggles that could reshape entire societies. These tensions between different sources of authority weren't just political problems. They reflected deeper questions about the nature of legitimate power and social organization that urban societies were still learning to navigate. How should decisions be made that affect large numbers of people? What gives some individuals the right to command others? How can diverse populations with different interests and values be held together in stable communities? Different civilizations developed different answers to these questions, and their solutions continued to evolve as they encountered new challenges and opportunities. Some societies developed more democratic forms of decision-making that gave ordinary citizens significant voice in governance. Others created more hierarchical systems that concentrated power in the hands of small elites. But even the most authoritarian urban societies had to develop more sophisticated methods of governance than the simple personal authority that had characterized smaller communities. They needed bureaucratic systems that could implement decisions across large territories, legal frameworks that could resolve disputes fairly, and communication networks that could coordinate activities across vast distances. These administrative innovations required new types of professional expertise. Scribes who could maintain accurate records, engineers who could design and supervise large construction projects, diplomats who could negotiate with foreign powers, military officers who could organize and lead large armies. Urban societies became increasingly dependent on these specialized professionals, creating new forms of social stratification based on knowledge and skill rather than just wealth or family connections. The rise of professional classes had profound implications for social mobility and cultural development. For the first time in human history, individuals could potentially rise in status through education and merit, rather than just inheritance or force. This created incentives for the development of more sophisticated educational systems and more meritocratic approaches to social organization. At the same time, the increasing complexity of urban societies made them more vulnerable to disruption when key systems failed or when they faced unprecedented challenges. A breakdown in food distribution could lead to urban riots. A collapse in trade networks could cripple entire economies. Military defeats could result in the destruction of political systems that had taken centuries to develop. These vulnerabilities became more apparent as urban civilizations matured and their territories expanded. The larger and more complex a society became, the more ways it could potentially fail. This created ongoing tensions between the desire for growth and expansion and the need for stability and security. Some civilizations tried to resolve these tensions by creating more resilient systems that could adapt to changing circumstances. They developed diversified economies that weren't dependent on single resources or trade routes. They created federal political systems that could maintain unity while allowing for local variation. They established cultural institutions that could preserve essential knowledge even if particular cities or regions were disrupted. Other societies focused on expansion and conquest as solutions to their internal vulnerabilities. They sought to control larger territories and more resources, reasoning that greater size would provide greater security. But this approach often created new problems, as managing vast territories required even more complex administrative systems and created more opportunities for internal conflict. The tension between complexity and stability became one of the central challenges of urban civilization. Every solution to one problem seemed to create new problems that required even more sophisticated solutions. This dynamic process of increasing complexity drove much of the innovation and development that characterized ancient civilizations. But it also meant that these societies were constantly evolving and adapting, never reaching a stable equilibrium that could be maintained indefinitely. The history of urban civilization is thus a story of constant change and adaptation rather than gradual progress towards some predetermined goal. This pattern of ongoing transformation has continued throughout human history and shows no signs of stopping in our modern world. If anything, the pace of change has accelerated dramatically as our societies have become even more complex and interconnected than those ancient urban pioneers could have imagined. We face many of the same fundamental challenges that confronted those early city builders. How do we coordinate the activities of large numbers of people with diverse interests and values? How do we make collective decisions that affect millions or billions of individuals? How do we manage the environmental impacts of intensive resource use? How do we preserve essential knowledge and cultural values across generations while still adapting to changing circumstances? The specific technologies and institutions we use to address these challenges are obviously very different from those available to ancient civilizations, but the underlying problems remain remarkably similar, and we can still learn much from studying how our ancestors approached these fundamental questions of social organization and cultural development. Perhaps most importantly, the history of urban civilization reminds us that there are many different ways to organize human societies, and that the particular arrangements we take for granted today are neither inevitable nor permanent. Every generation has the opportunity and the responsibility to adapt inherited institutions, to meet new challenges, and to create new solutions to persistent problems. The journey from Ice Age hunting bands to complex urban civilizations shows us that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of creating entirely new forms of social organization when circumstances require it. But it also shows us that these adaptations always come with costs as well as benefits, and that every solution creates new challenges that future generations will have to address. As we continue to grapple with the consequences of our urban technological civilization, we can draw both inspiration and caution from this long history of human adaptation and innovation. Our ancestors managed to create stable, productive communities under conditions that were often harsh and always uncertain. They developed technologies and institutions that allowed them to thrive in environments that would have been impossible for their predecessors to inhabit. But they also experienced the costs of rapid social change, the disruption of traditional ways of life, the emergence of new forms of inequality and conflict. Understanding this history doesn't provide us with simple answers to our contemporary challenges, but it does give us perspective on the nature of those challenges and confidence that creative solutions are possible. The transformation from small Ice Age communities to vast urban civilizations represents one of the most dramatic changes in the human experience. Yet it happened through the accumulated decisions of countless individuals and communities, each responding to their immediate circumstances and trying to create better lives for themselves and their children. That same process of gradual but transformative change continues today. Every choice we make about how to organize our communities, what technologies to develop and deploy, what values to prioritize, and what futures to work toward, contributes to the ongoing evolution of human civilization. We are not passive recipients of historical forces beyond our control. We are active participants in the same process of adaptation and innovation that has been shaping human societies since our ancestors first began to plant seeds in the warming soils left behind by retreating glaciers. The future of our civilization will be determined not by inevitable historical forces, but by the choices we make and the actions we take in response to the challenges and opportunities we face. The story that began in the frozen mammoth steppes of the Ice Age continues in our cities and communities today. We are the latest chapter in a long saga of human creativity and adaptation, and how that chapter unfolds depends on our willingness to learn from the past while boldly facing the future. And so we reach the end of our journey through deep time. from the frozen mammoth steppes to the bustling streets of humanity's first cities. What we've explored together isn't just ancient history. It's the story of how we became who we are today. Every valley carved by retreating glaciers, every seed planted by early farmers, every clay tablet inscribed by the world's first scribes, all of it led to this moment, to the world you're sitting in right now. The Ice Age didn't just reshape continents and create new landscapes. It forged the human spirit of adaptation and innovation that still drives us today. When our ancestors faced a world of towering ice sheets and saber-toothed predators, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They created art in dark caves, developed tools that were sharper than modern surgical instruments, and built communities that could endure the harshest conditions imaginable. As the ice retreated and the world warmed, they adapted again. They learned to farm, to build permanent settlements, to create the first cities and writing systems. Each transformation seemed impossible until it happened, and then it became the foundation for everything that followed. Looking back across this vast sweep of time, one thing becomes crystal clear. Change has always been the only constant in human history. Our ancestors didn't succeed by resisting change or trying to hold on to the past. They succeeded by embracing the unknown, by experimenting with new ways of living, and by working together to solve problems that no individual could handle alone. That same spirit of innovation and cooperation is what we need today as we face our own unprecedented challenges. We are the descendants of mammoth hunters and cave painters, of the first farmers and city builders, of everyone who refused to accept that the world had to stay the way it was. Their legacy isn't just in the cities we live in or the technologies we use. It's in our capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to create new solutions when the old ways no longer work. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the pace of change in our modern world, remember where you came from. You carry in your DNA the wisdom of countless generations who faced impossible odds and found a way forward. The story that began in the ice continues with you. And like every chapter that came before, how it unfolds depends entirely on what we choose to do next.